One small act of kindness, or one single word of truth, can spread like a wildfire through the world. Witness the stories of those who ignited change and inspired others to do the same. Hit subscribe now and help us spread the light today.
My son hired a caregiver for me 6 months after my wife's stroke. Last Thursday, I drove that caregiver to her final checkup at the clinic in Brentwood. When my son stepped into the hallway to answer his phone, the nurse practitioner slid her chair close and dropped her voice to barely a whisper. "Mr. Calloway, I need you to look at something before your son comes back." She turned her monitor toward me, and what I saw on that screen made the room tilt beneath my feet. Before I could ask a single question, the door opened. My son walked back in, smiling that warm, practiced smile he'd worn every single day for the past 6 months. "Please hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now." That nurse's whisper would force me to question everything I believed about the person I'd raised. But let me start from the beginning, because nothing about this makes sense unless you understand who we were before all of it happened. I'm Walter Calloway, 67 years old, a retired high school history teacher from Franklin, Tennessee, 38 years in the classroom. I coached junior varsity baseball for 20 of those years, and I still think in inning, middle, and ends. Beginning, middle, and end. My wife, Margaret, taught second grade at the same school for 22 years before she retired. We were that couple, the one other couples pointed to when they talked about what marriage was supposed to look like. Then, 14 months ago, Margaret had a stroke in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning. She'd been making oatmeal. I found her on the floor beside the stove, the burner still on, a small blue flame under an empty pot. The doctors at Williamson Medical Center were honest with me. The stroke had affected her right side significantly. She would need intensive rehabilitation, daily assistance, and patience measured in years rather than months. I was 67 years old, with 2 replaced knees and a heart that required a medication I'd been taking since my 50s. I was not the right person to be her sole caregiver, no matter how badly I wanted to be. Our son, Derek, was 39, a financial consultant based in Nashville, about 25 minutes from our house. Our daughter Paula lived in Portland with her husband and 2 kids, flying in when she could, which meant twice a year if we were lucky. When the hospital social worker sat me down to discuss long-term care options, Derek was there beside me before I'd finished dialing his number. "Dad," he said, gripping my hand across the table, "I'll handle everything. You focus on Mom. That's all you need to do." And he did handle everything, at least at first. Within 2 weeks, he had interviewed and hired a professional in-home caregiver named Carol Stanton, a registered nurse with 17 years of experience and references that checked out. He'd arranged for physical therapy 3 times per week. He'd installed handrails in our bathroom, a ramp at the back door, a medical alert system on Margaret's wrist. He showed up every Sunday for dinner, sometimes twice during the week, always with groceries or flowers or the exact prescription refill we needed before I'd even noticed we were running low. I told my neighbor Howard next door that I didn't know what I'd done to deserve a son like Derek. Howard was 71, a retired county sheriff with the kind of eyes that had seen too much of the world to take anything at face value. He'd nodded slowly when I said it. "That's a lot of involvement," he'd said. "For a man with his own business to run." I'd waved him off. "That's just Derek," I'd said. "He's always been like that." But even then, I remembered small things I'd pushed aside. How Derek had started asking about our financial accounts more frequently after Margaret's stroke. How he'd mentioned, casually, 3 or 4 times, that our house had appreciated significantly in the neighborhood market, and that some families in our situation considered downsizing to free up equity. How he'd asked, once, whether we'd updated our will recently, and when I'd changed the subject, he brought it back around to it within the same conversation. "Just being practical, Dad. Just making sure everything's in order." Carol, the caregiver, was good at her job, quiet, efficient, warm with Margaret in a way that felt genuine. Margaret couldn't speak clearly since the stroke, her words coming out scrambled and effortful. But she'd smile when Carol came in each morning, and that meant something to me. Carol handled medications, physical therapy coordination, bathing, meal preparation. She kept detailed logs. She never complained. The problem wasn't Carol. I want to be clear about that. The problem started the day Carol came to me with something she hadn't expected to find. It was a Wednesday, about 4 months after she'd started with us. I was grading old history exams I'd kept for nostalgia. One of those retired teacher habits I hadn't been able to break, when Carol knocked on my study door with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. Something careful, something that looked like it was measuring the cost of what it was about to say. "Mr. Calloway," she said slowly, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm only asking because I care about Mrs. Margaret's well-being." She held up a small orange prescription bottle. This was on the kitchen counter this morning next to her medication organizer. I don't recognize it from her prescription list. "Do you know what this is?" I looked at the bottle. There was a label, but it had been partially damaged, water-stained until most of the text was unreadable. What I could make out was a partial medication name and a dosage. I did not recognize it. "Derek dropped off a bag of stuff on Monday," I said slowly. "He said it was a new supplement the doctor recommended." Carol nodded carefully. "Which doctor authorized it?" I didn't know. I hadn't thought to ask. Derek had said it was helpful for stroke recovery, something he'd researched. I'd trusted him the way I'd trusted him with every other arrangement he'd made since the stroke. Carol said she'd look into it. She asked me not to give Margaret anything from that bottle until she'd had a chance to identify it. I agreed, and I didn't mention it to Derek. That Thursday, Carol called me from the clinic during Margaret's follow-up appointment. She'd brought the bottle to show the nurse practitioner, a woman named Janet Fry, who'd been treating Margaret since the hospital. Carol hadn't told me she was going to do that. She'd acted on her own professional judgment, and I understand now that decision probably saved my wife's life. I drove to the clinic. Derek came too, because Derek always came to medical appointments. He sat in the chair beside Margaret's bed with his jacket draped perfectly over the armrest, scrolling through his phone with the practiced ease of a man who had nothing to worry about. When Derek stepped into the hallway to answer a call, Janet Fry moved fast. She turned her monitor toward me and pointed to something on the screen, a pharmaceutical reference page, clinical notes, a highlighted section on drug interactions with anticoagulants, the blood thinner Margaret had been on since her stroke. "Mr. Calloway," she said, voice barely above a breath, "the substance in that bottle has not been prescribed by this practice or any physician in Mrs. Margaret's care team. Combined with her anticoagulant, it increases her bleeding risk significantly. She's been showing symptoms consistent with this interaction for at least 6 weeks. We thought it was stroke-related regression. It isn't." The door opened. Derek walked back in, smiling. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I sat in the passenger seat of Derek's car, watching his hands on the steering wheel, hands I'd held when he was 3 years old learning to cross a street, and I tried to make what I knew fit with who I believed he was. It wouldn't fit. I kept turning it over the way you turn over a shape that doesn't belong in the space you're trying to put it in. He talked the whole drive. Work stuff. The Nashville market. A client who was being difficult. He was relaxed, smooth. The same Derek who'd sat beside me in the hospital social worker's office and promised to handle everything. Back at the house, he went straight to the kitchen to refill Margaret's medication organizer. I watched from the hallway as he opened the weekly pill dispenser and began sorting tablets with the same practiced efficiency he applied to everything. I said his name quietly. He looked up with that easy smile. I said, "Walk me through each thing you're putting in there." Something shifted in his expression. Just a fraction. Like a door eased slightly open before someone pushes it closed again. He explained each compartment calmly. Blood pressure. Cholesterol. The vitamin D the doctor recommended, and the new supplement, he said, picking up a small bottle from the bag he'd brought. I stepped forward and took the bottle from his hand before he could open it. He looked at me steadily. "Dad, that's the one I told you about. The stroke recovery research. It's completely safe." I said, "Janet Fry told me today that no one on your mother's care team prescribed this." I said it quietly. I said it looking him directly in the eye. The silence in that kitchen lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Derek sat down at the kitchen table the way a man sits down when his legs have decided something, before the rest of him catches up. "Dad," he started. "No," I said. "I want you to tell me the truth. Not the version of the truth that manages my reaction. The actual truth." He put his hands flat on the table. He was quiet for long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming. Then he said, "I've been drowning." He'd been underwater financially for nearly 2 years before the stroke. A business deal he hadn't told us about had gone badly. a private investment in a commercial property venture with two partners who turned out to be less trustworthy than he believed. He'd lost $400,000. Not his savings, because he'd been too smart for that. He'd borrowed against them. He'd used instruments I won't pretend I fully understood. Collateralized debt against his business assets. A private line of credit against assets that included his future inheritance from Margaret and me. When the stroke happened, he'd seen, and I use his word, an opportunity. Not to hurt her, he said quickly, leaning forward. I want you to understand that. I would never want to hurt her. I just needed to demonstrate on paper that her recovery had plateaued, that she required a higher level of facility care. If she moved to a memory care facility, the house would become a liquidatable asset. Just temporarily. Just until I could restructure. I looked at my son across the kitchen table we'd sat at for 30 years of holidays and homework and baseball discussions, and I said, "You've been making your mother sicker on purpose to take our house." He flinched. Not making her sicker, just slowing her recovery. The distinction seemed important to him. I stood up. I told him to leave. I told him calmly, the way I'd spent 38 years telling students that behavior had consequences regardless of the circumstances that led to it. He tried to say more. I walked to the front door and opened it. He left. I sat in the living room for a long time after that. Margaret was asleep in her room where Carol had helped her settle for an afternoon rest. I could hear her breathing from the hallway, slow and even. I thought about the 6 weeks Janet Fry had described. 6 weeks of worsening symptoms we'd attributed to her stroke. 6 weeks of my wife struggling harder than she'd needed to, losing ground she might have held. My throat tightened and stayed that way. The next morning I drove to see Howard. He sat me down at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and listened to everything without interrupting once. When I finished, he put his cup down and looked at me with those retired sheriff eyes. "You have a window," he said, "before he decides what to do next. Use it. Document everything now, tonight. The bottle, your conversation, every date and detail you can recall, and get an attorney before he does." That afternoon, I drove to the office of a woman named Grace Delacroix, an elder law attorney in Franklin that Howard had recommended. She was 55, direct, and unimpressed by nothing. She listened to everything I told her with her hands folded on her desk and her expression giving away exactly nothing. She said, "We need 3 things. Medical documentation from Janet Fry, financial records establishing motive, and whatever chain of custody we can establish for that supplement bottle." She paused. "Mr. Calloway, this may constitute elder abuse under Tennessee statute. Depending on what the full toxicology shows, it could go further. I want you to be prepared for that." I said I was prepared. I wasn't entirely, but I said it. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved carefully. Janet Fry prepared a detailed medical report, documenting the unauthorized supplement, the drug interaction, the 6 weeks of accelerated symptom regression, and her clinical opinion that the regression was consistent with deliberate administration rather than natural stroke progression. She did not look happy writing it, but she did not hesitate. I kept a written log, every date Derek had visited, every time he brought medication supplements or research, every conversation I could remember about the house value, the will, the financial planning that had felt slightly wrong in ways I couldn't articulate at the time. Written down, the pattern was unmistakable. It had been unmistakable for months. I had chosen not to see it because seeing it required believing something I did not want to believe about my son. Carol had kept her own logs, as it turned out. Professional records she maintained as standard practice. Dates the supplement had appeared in the medication area. Dates she'd noticed it given to Margaret. Those records became part of Grace's file. Derek called 3 times during those 2 weeks. Twice I let it go to voicemail. The 3rd time I answered and told him I needed some space to process everything. He was careful on the phone, measured, apologetic in the way of someone who has assessed the situation and decided apology is the strategic choice. "Dad, I'm genuinely sorry. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was in a desperate place. I should have come to you, not done this. I said I understood. I said I needed more time." I kept him on the line just long enough to establish that he was aware of what he'd done. Grace had suggested I do that. The call with Paula was different. She'd flown in on a red-eye from Portland the day after I called her. arriving at 6 in the morning with her coat still on from the airport and her eyes red in a way that wasn't from the travel. She sat at the kitchen table and read every document I put in front of her. She read them twice. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Mom doesn't know any of this." "No," I said. "We need to tell her." "Eventually, I know." She wiped her eyes and set her jaw in the way she'd done since she was 12 years old, refusing to accept a bad situation. She said, "What do you need me to do?" Paula stayed for a week. She was there the morning the detective from the Franklin Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit came to take my statement. Detective Marcus Webb was 40-something, methodical, and thorough in the way that made you feel slightly uncomfortable even when you were the victim. He read every document. He asked questions that doubled back on themselves to check for inconsistency. He listened to Janet Fry's report with the careful attention of someone building something one piece at a time. At the end of 2 hours, he said, "Mr. Calloway, based on what you've provided, we have sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation into elder financial abuse and the unauthorized administration of substances." He paused. "I want to prepare you. If the financial records substantiate the motive, and the medical evidence is as conclusive as Dr. Fry indicates, this could result in felony charges." Paula reached over and took my hand. "He's my son," I said. "I know what that means. I'm not asking you to stop. Derek was arrested on a Thursday morning. I know, because Paula was with me, and she was the one who answered the phone when Detective Webb called to tell us it had happened." She handed me the phone, and I listened to the detective's voice explaining calmly that Derek had been taken into custody and would be arraigned the following morning. I said thank you. I set the phone on the counter. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard where Derek had learned to throw a baseball, and I felt something I still don't have an exact word for. Not satisfaction. Not grief, exactly. Something that lives in the space between what you hoped for and what is. The arraignment was brief. Bail was set. Derek appeared in court 2 weeks later for the preliminary hearing, looking like a version of himself that had been put through something. The financial consultant composure was intact, but underneath it was something thinner, like a wall that has been soaked through and hasn't yet fallen, but is no longer capable of holding anything. His attorney argued that the supplement had been given in good faith, that Derek had genuinely believed it was beneficial, that there was no evidence of intent to harm. Grace dismantled the argument piece by piece. The supplement was not commercially available through legitimate channels. Derek had researched its interaction profile, and the search history on his home computer showed he'd queried the phrase anticoagulant interaction risks the same week he'd first introduced the supplement to Margaret's routine. He had not consulted any physician. He had no medical training. The financial motive was documented in records that went back 22 months. The moment I remember most clearly from that hearing is not the judge's ruling. It is Derek turning in his seat to look at me across the courtroom. I had been watching him for most of the proceedings, the way you watch something you're trying to memorize or understand. And when his eyes found mine, I didn't look away. He didn't say anything. I don't think either of us had words available for what that look was. The judge ruled that the case would proceed to trial. It did not go to trial. 3 weeks before the scheduled date, Derek's attorney contacted Grace and indicated that Derek wished to enter a guilty plea in exchange for a sentencing recommendation. Grace consulted with the district attorney's office. They agreed. Derek stood in Williamson County Criminal Court on a gray November morning and said, in a clear voice that sounded nothing like the son I recognized, that he was guilty of elder financial exploitation and the unauthorized administration of a controlled substance to a vulnerable adult. He said it the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed, until the emotion is no longer accessible in the words. The judge, a man in his late 60s named Arthur Crane, looked at Derek for a long time before he responded. Judge Crane said that in 23 years on the bench, the cases that disturbed him most were not the ones involving strangers. They were the ones in which a person exploited the specific trust that family creates, because that trust is not repaired by a verdict. He sentenced Derek to 4 years in state correctional custody, 3 years of supervised probation following release, full restitution of all documented medical and legal expenses, and mandatory financial fraud counseling. Paula was beside me. She was crying quietly without trying to stop it. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me the way she'd done when she was small, and something had frightened her. Margaret was not in the courtroom. We had decided together, the three of us, that she did not need to be there. She knew what Derek had done. We had told her in the way you tell someone something terrible, slowly, carefully, giving them time to put it somewhere inside themselves. She had listened without speaking for a long time, and then she had looked at me with the particular clarity that her good days produced, and she had said in her effortful post-stroke way, he needed help, and he chose the wrong kind. That sentence is the one I think about most. Margaret's recovery, once the supplement was removed and the correct treatment restored, moved faster than Janet Freya projected in her conservative estimates. The regression of those 6 weeks reversed almost entirely within a month. Her speech therapy showed measurable improvement. She began walking the length of our hallway without the walker on good days. One morning, I found her in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee, which she hadn't done since before the stroke, and she looked up at me with an expression of complete exasperation and said, "The machine is different, and I can't remember where the filters are." I found the filters. We made coffee together. I didn't say anything about what that meant to me. I didn't have to. Carol continued working with us through the spring. When she eventually moved to a position closer to her own family, she gave us 2 weeks' notice and a folder of detailed handover notes, organized in a way that only someone who genuinely cared about the outcome would bother with. I wrote her a reference letter that I meant entirely. Paula calls twice a week now. She's talked about the possibility of relocating closer, and I've stopped trying to talk her out of it the way I used to. Howard checks in from next door with the same consistency he's maintained for 11 years, bringing his blunt observations and his coffee, and his refusal to soften things that don't need softening. I've come to understand that bluntness is a form of respect. I visit Derek. I started 3 months after sentencing. Paula didn't come with me the first time. I drove alone to the facility in Columbia, 45 minutes south of Franklin, and I sat across a table from my son in a room with fluorescent lighting and no windows, and I looked at him for a moment before I said anything. He looked smaller. I don't know how else to say it. Not thinner, not diminished in any physical sense, but smaller in the way people become when the architecture of their exterior life stops holding them up. I said, "I'm not here to forgive you today. I'm not there yet. I'm here because you're my son, and that isn't something that turns off." He nodded. He didn't argue with it or try to reframe it or manage my reaction. He just nodded. We talked for an hour, mostly about small things. The baseball season. Paula's kids. The filter problem with the coffee machine that Margaret and I had eventually solved. I don't know if that was the right way to handle it. I don't have a template for this, but I know that sitting across from him felt necessary, like something I owed to the version of him that existed before the choices he made. I've started speaking at a senior center in Brentwood once a month. They invited me after a social worker connected through Grace's office heard about the case and thought I might have something useful to say. I stand in a room with people my age and older, and I talk about the ways that trust operates in families, how it can be the thing that protects you, and also the thing that prevents you from seeing what's in front of you. The question I get asked most often is whether I blame myself. I tell them honestly that I did for a long time, that there is a version of this story where I ask harder questions earlier, where I don't hand over the responsibility for my wife's care so completely that I stop paying attention, where I notice the signs before they cost 6 weeks of Margaret's recovery. But I also tell them that guilt is only useful up to the point where it teaches you something. Past that point, it's just a weight you carry for someone else to feel better about the story's moral. What I should have done is stay present, stay involved, not because I suspected anything, but because love is not a task you delegate and then stop checking on. That's the lesson I carry now, out of everything that happened in that year. You cannot outsource the attention that the people you love require from you specifically. Margaret is sitting in the garden as I write this. It is late May, and the roses she planted 15 years ago have come back this spring with an extravagance that seems almost pointed, like they know something about what this year has cost and are responding in the only language available to them. She's got dirt on her gloves and a look of focused concentration on her face, and every few minutes she looks up at the kitchen window where I'm sitting, and she raises one gloved hand in the small wave she's been giving me for 41 years. We lost almost a year to someone's choices. We did not lose each other. Sometimes, in the full accounting of things, that has to be the number that matters most. If this story stayed with you, Please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Hit subscribe and join this community. And tell me in the comments, had you ever trusted someone so completely that it made you blind to the truth? Your answer might help someone else see what they're missing before it's too late.